how ancient Egypt became the world's first superpower. The year is 1274 BCE. The desert sand outside the fortress city of Kadesh runs red with blood. Ramesses II, the god-king of Egypt, leads 20,000 men against the Hittite Empire in what history will remember as one of antiquity's greatest battles. We're told this is why Egypt became a superpower, because of military genius, divine pharaohs, and superior weaponry. But that's the illusion they wanted you to see. Egypt didn't conquer the ancient world because of chariots or swords. They conquered it because they controlled the ledger. They became the world's first superpower, not through warfare, but through the systematic monopolization of grain, gold, and the economic choke points of 3 continents. This is the story of how a desert kingdom used accounting, not arrows, to build an empire that lasted 3 millennia, and how they kept the balance sheet hidden behind the gods. Stand on the banks of the Nile in 1450 BCE, and you'd witness something no other civilization on Earth could match. Gold-laden barges stretching for miles, each one carrying tribute from vassal kingdoms. Nubian gold miners sending 40,000 deben of pure bullion north every harvest season. Syrian merchants unloading Lebanese cedar, Afghan lapis lazuli, and Cypriot copper at Memphis docks. The pharaoh's treasury at Thebes held more accumulated wealth than all the kingdoms of Mesopotamia combined. The temples weren't just religious centers, they were central banks. The priests of Amun-Ra at Karnak controlled grain reserves that could feed 5 million people for a year. Their scribes tracked every bushel, every ingot, every slave with a precision that wouldn't be matched until the Medici bankers of Renaissance Florence. The empire stretched from the Euphrates River to the 4th cataract of the Nile, covering nearly 2 million square kilometers. But beneath the gold leaf and the granite colossi, beneath the divine propaganda carved into every temple wall, the foundation was rotting. Egypt's rise to superpower status began with an addiction, an economic dependency so profound it would shape every military campaign, every diplomatic treaty, every pharaonic decision for 1,000 years. They were addicted to the Nile's flood cycle. Every spring, snowmelt from the Ethiopian highlands sent a predictable surge of water and sediment downstream. This wasn't just irrigation, it was the world's first automated wealth generation system. The flood deposited 150 million tons of fertile silt across the valley every single year. Egyptian farmers didn't just grow food, they manufactured surplus on an industrial scale. Wheat yields were 8-to-1, when Mesopotamian farms struggled to achieve 3-to-1. A single Egyptian farmer could feed 5 people. This agricultural monopoly created the economic foundation for everything else. But it also created a trap. The flood wasn't random. It was predictable enough to build a civilization around, but unpredictable enough to destroy one. The Nilometers, those stone staircases carved into the riverbanks, weren't just measuring water levels. They were measuring Egypt's GDP. A flood of 14 cubits meant famine. 16 cubits meant prosperity. 18 cubits meant catastrophic flooding and loss. The entire economy lived and died by 2 meters of water variance. Now here's where the accounting gets dark. The pharaohs realized they couldn't control the Nile, but they could control the perception of the Nile. They turned the flood into a divine event, with the pharaoh as the intermediary between the gods and the water. They built an entire religious infrastructure around the idea that the king's piety determined the harvest. This wasn't theology, it was economic propaganda designed to centralize power. When the flood came as predicted, the pharaoh took credit. When it failed, the priests blamed the people's sin and demanded more tribute for temple construction. The beauty of this system was its unfalsifiability. Good harvest meant divine favor. Bad harvest meant insufficient devotion. Either way, the gold flowed upward to the royal treasury and the temple complexes. But the antagonist in Egypt's story wasn't a foreign king or an invading army. It was the balance sheet itself. By 2686 BCE, during the Old Kingdom, Egypt faced its first economic crisis. The pyramids weren't just tombs. They were the ancient world's equivalent of a sovereign debt crisis disguised as architecture. Think about the math. The Great Pyramid of Khufu required 2.3 million limestone blocks, each weighing 2.5 tons on average. The construction took 20 years and employed a permanent workforce of 20,000 skilled laborers, plus a rotating crew of 100,000 seasonal workers during flood season. These weren't slaves, they were paid employees. The logistics were staggering. The workers consumed 40,000 loaves of bread daily, plus onions, beer, and meat. The Old Kingdom pharaohs were running a permanent fiscal deficit to maintain these projects. They were bleeding the treasury dry to build monuments to their own immortality. The pyramid scheme, if you'll pardon the phrase, only worked as long as the agricultural surplus continued. The moment the Nile failed, the entire system collapsed like a house of cards. And in 2181 BCE, it did. The climate changed. The monsoon patterns that fed the Ethiopian highlands shifted south. The floods weakened. For 30 consecutive years, the Nile's inundation dropped below critical levels. This was the first intermediate period, and it was an economic apocalypse. The centralized food distribution system collapsed. Regional governors, the nomarchs, stopped sending grain tribute to Memphis. They hoarded local supplies instead. The pharaoh's authority, which rested entirely on the perception of divine control over the harvest, evaporated overnight. Egypt didn't fragment because of political disagreement. It fragmented because the cash stopped flowing. Local warlords couldn't pay troops in grain that didn't exist. For over a century, Egypt experienced hyperinflation of the only currency that mattered, food. A sack of emmer wheat that once traded for 1 devon of copper now cost 10. Starvation became endemic. The archaeological record shows a spike in diseases related to malnutrition. The texts from this period are haunting. One inscription reads, "The land spins around like a potter's wheel. The poor man has become wealthy, and he who could not make sandals now owns riches." This wasn't social mobility, it was economic chaos. The old hierarchies collapsed because the medium of exchange, grain backed by the pharaoh's divine authority, had become worthless. But Egypt's geography was its salvation. The deserts on either side acted as natural barriers, preventing full foreign conquest. By 2055 BCE, a family of nomarchs from Thebes managed to consolidate power and reunify the country. This was the Middle Kingdom, and the pharaohs who emerged from it had learned a brutal lesson. Never again would they allow regional governors to control local grain supplies. The solution was militarization of the economy. Pharaohs like Senusret, The third built a network of fortresses in Nubia, not primarily for defense, but for resource extraction. Nubia had gold. Nubia had it in quantities that made Egyptian deposits look like pocket change. The fortresses at Bohang, Semna, and Uranarti weren't military outposts. They were corporate offices for a state-run mining operation. Egyptian administrators used forced labor to extract an estimated 400 tons of gold from Nubian mines during the Middle Kingdom alone. That gold became the hard currency backing Egypt's regional trade dominance. But the Middle Kingdom pharaohs made a fatal mistake. They assumed military control of resources was sufficient. They forgot about technology transfer. Around 1650 BCE, a Semitic people called the Hyksos invaded from the east. They brought with them composite bows, horse-drawn chariots, and bronze working techniques superior to Egypt's. The Hyksos conquered the Nile Delta not through numerical superiority, but through technological arbitrage. They had weapons Egypt couldn't match and mobility Egypt couldn't counter. For over a century, Egypt was split between Hyksos control in the north and a diminished Egyptian kingdom in the south. This was the humiliation that changed everything. When Ahmose finally expelled the Hyksos around 1550 BCE, he didn't just restore Egyptian independence. He launched a permanent war economy designed to prevent such humiliation from ever happening again. The new kingdom wasn't a kingdom in the traditional sense. It was a militarized extraction corporation with a divine CEO. The pharaohs adopted Hyksos military technology, improved it, and then used it to build an empire stretching from Syria to Sudan. But here's what the history books miss. Every single military campaign of the new kingdom was an economic acquisition, not a territorial one. When Thutmose III fought 17 campaigns in Syria-Palestine, he wasn't spreading Egyptian culture. He was securing trade routes and imposing tribute obligations. The Battle of Megiddo in 1457 BCE was the smoking gun. After defeating a coalition of Canaanite city-states, Thutmose didn't annex the territory. He installed puppet rulers and imposed an annual tribute system. The tablets recovered from this period show the accounting in brutal detail. The city of Megiddo alone was required to send Egypt 340 devon of gold, plus grain, livestock, and slaves annually. Multiply that across dozens of vassal states, and you begin to see the scale of the operation. Egypt's military wasn't an army. It was a collection agency with swords. The tribute system created a positive feedback loop. More tribute meant more gold. More gold meant the ability to hire more mercenaries and build more ships. More military power meant the ability to extract more tribute from more territories. For 2 centuries, this system worked flawlessly. The treasury at Thebes overflowed. Pharaohs like Amenhotep III had so much wealth they built entire palace complexes just to store the overflow. The colossi of Memnon, those twin statues that still stand at Thebes, weren't religious monuments. They were advertisements. They were 70-foot-tall billboards announcing to every foreign diplomat and merchant, "This is what happens when you control the ledger." But the system had a hidden weakness. It required constant expansion to maintain the inflow of tribute. The moment Egypt stopped acquiring new vassal states, the revenue stream would plateau. An expansion required enemies who were wealthy enough to be worth conquering, but weak enough to be defeated. By 1274 BCE, Egypt had run out of easy targets. The only remaining prize was Syria, and Syria was contested by the Hittite Empire a rival superpower with iron weapons and an army every bit as formidable as Egypt's. Ramesses II wagered everything on the Battle of Kadesh. He brought 20,000 men, 2,000 chariots, and a logistical train that stretched for miles. The Hittites brought more. The battle was a bloodbath and a stalemate. Neither side could achieve decisive victory. Both empires were exhausted. Here's the part they don't teach in school. Ramesses II declared Kadesh a great Egyptian victory and covered temple walls with propaganda depicting him as a solo warrior crushing the Hittites. But the treaty signed 16 years later tells the real story. It was the ancient world's first recorded peace treaty, and it was a treaty of mutual exhaustion. Egypt and the Hittites agreed to split Syria and cease hostilities. Why? Because both empires were broke. The war had cost more than either economy could sustain. The tribute system had reached its maximum geographic extent. There were no more territories to conquer that would generate positive return on investment. Egypt's ledger was bleeding red ink for the first time in 2 centuries. Ramesses II tried to solve the problem the way failing empires always do. He debased the currency. During his reign, the silver and gold content of trade ingots decreased by nearly 30%. He built monuments on a scale even grander than his predecessors, the Ramesseum and Abu symbol, trying to project strength while the economy weakened. And he lived long enough, 66 years on the throne, to watch the consequences unfold. By the time he died in 1213 BCE, the Egyptian economy was structurally unsound. The vassal states were restless. The tribute was irregular. The Nile floods were becoming less predictable due to another climate shift. And a new threat was emerging from the Mediterranean. The Sea Peoples, a coalition of displaced Mediterranean tribes, began raiding Egypt's coastal territories around 1200 BCE. Egypt repelled them militarily, but the cost was catastrophic. The new kingdom pharaohs had to melt down temple gold to pay the army. They cut rations for workers, leading to the first recorded labor strikes in history. The tomb builders at Deir el-Medina walked off the job in 1152 BCE because they hadn't been paid in grain for weeks. Let that sink in. The workers building the pharaoh's tomb to ensure his immortality were starving. Sovereignty is solvency, and Egypt was losing both. The final collapse came not with a bang, but with a whimper. By 1070 BCE, the new kingdom simply fractured. The pharaohs in the north couldn't pay the army. The priests of Amun in the south controlled more wealth than the crown. Egypt split into rival dynasties, neither strong enough to reunify the country. The empire was gone. The tributary states in Syria and Nubia declared independence. The gold stopped flowing. For the next 4 centuries, Egypt was a shadow of its former self. It was conquered by Libya, then Nubia, then Assyria, then Persia. Each conqueror extracted wealth from the Nile Valley, paying off their own debts with Egyptian grain and gold. When Alexander the Great conquered Egypt in 332 BCE, he didn't have to fight. He was welcomed as a liberator from Persian rule. The Ptolemaic dynasty that followed ran Egypt like a colonial extraction operation, shipping Egyptian grain to feed Greek cities across the Mediterranean. The final chapter came in 30 BCE when Cleopatra VII committed suicide and Egypt became a province of Rome. The Roman emperors understood what the pharaohs had known. Egypt was the ancient world's breadbasket, and whoever controlled Egypt controlled the Mediterranean grain supply. For 3 more centuries, Roman administrators extracted wheat from Egyptian farms to feed Rome's 1,000,000 inhabitants. They called Egypt the gift of the Nile, but it was really the gift of accounting. The Romans refined the tribute system to industrial efficiency. Every bushel tracked, every tax paid, every farmer's yield recorded in duplicate. The legacy of Egypt's economic empire lasted longer than the empire itself. The administrative systems, the granary networks, the tax collection methods, all of these survived because they were fundamentally sound. They only collapsed when the underlying resource, the Nile's predictable flood, became unpredictable, and when the cost of maintaining the military exceeded the tribute it could extract. Here's the lesson that applies to every empire that followed. Superpowers aren't built on military strength or cultural superiority. They're built on resource monopolies, efficient extraction, and the ability to project economic power across distance. Egypt controlled the Mediterranean grain trade for 2,000 years, not because their soldiers were braver, but because their accountants were better. They turned the Nile into a factory that produced food, gold, and leverage. And they built a religious and political system designed to obscure the economic mechanisms behind it all. When the factory stopped producing surplus, when the balance sheet flipped from black to red, the gods couldn't save them. The pyramids still stand because stone lasts forever. The empire fell because the cash ran out. Think about that the next time you hear about a modern superpower. Look past the aircraft carriers and the diplomatic rhetoric. Find the ledger. Find the resource monopoly. Find the debt. Because history doesn't repeat, but the balance sheets always rhyme. Egypt's 3,000-year run as a superpower began with a flood and ended with a drought. The water dried up, the gold stopped flowing, and the empire collapsed. But they left us the blueprint: control the resource, control the accounting, control the narrative. And when you can't do all 3 anymore, the end comes fast. If you want to understand history before the textbooks get it wrong, if you want to see the economic truth behind every rise and fall, subscribe to this channel, because the people who control the present are using the exact same playbook Egypt wrote in the sand 4,000 years ago. The only difference is the currency. Don't let them fool you with the monuments. Watch the ledger. Always watch the ledger. The pharaohs knew it. The emperors knew it. And now you know it too. Egypt didn't become the world's first superpower by accident. They became it by monopolizing grain, militarizing extraction, and hiding the balance sheet behind the gods, until the math caught up with them. It always does.